All right, well, I will introduce Aaron, or I will let Aaron introduce Steve, and we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you. Hello again, class. Welcome everyone joining us remotely as well. My name is Aaron, and first of all, I want to extend a huge thank you to the man I'm introducing today, Mr. Steve Ellis. Thank you so much for joining us. I know this has not been the easiest month or year to navigate for all of us, and from our brief conversation, it's more or less a miracle that we're all able to be here together today, so thank you again. For those of you who don't know, Steve has worn many different hats in the sphere of public lands. He served as the Deputy Director of the BLM, and before that, the Idaho State Director of the BLM, and the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest Supervisor, among many other leadership roles across the country. Steve has an undergraduate degree in forestry from Southern Illinois University, while also working as a firefighter and forest research technician. After college, he started working right here in Southern Idaho as a forester for the BLM, and worked his way up to the highest position at the BLM, where he oversaw the agency's 10,000 plus employees. One of the highlights of Steve's career, which certainly left a lasting mark here in Idaho, was his dedication to the conservation and restoration of this greater sage-grouse's habitat, which is critical to the health of countless species and seemingly always under threat from various interest groups. More famously, he was still at the BLM during the Bundy incident. I'm sure Steve will be able to talk about that more later. Without any more delay, I will hand the Zoom tile over to you, Mr. Ellis.
Thank you very, very much, and welcome, class. As I told Aaron and Emily earlier, I love talking to students, you know, and this is just such a wonderful opportunity to be here today from my home in rural Clackamas County, Oregon. Out back here, we live between Estacade and Molalla, and if you were following any of these fires over here, that's sort of ground zero for a lot of what was going on. And we did get pushed out of here for a week or 7 days, but we're back, and it's you know, it's the skies are clear, and happy to be here with you today. You know, it's really an honor to have been asked to be part of this what I would call a lecture series salute to Dr. John Freemuth. You know, I've known John for many years. I knew of him for you know, quite a while. You know of people, and then you know people. I knew of John, and then it wasn't until I became Idaho State Director that I began working a lot more closely with John, and we had him give talks, you know, at some of our employee meetings, and I always I followed some of his writings, and when I became Idaho State Director and even Deputy Director, and even more so when I retired at the end of the Obama administration, we stayed in fairly close touch. We probably traded emails weekly, and we chat about various issues. But you know, the things I remember about John, you know, he was such a solid voice in natural resource management and public policy, an important voice. And you know, when he passed away, you know, last May, there was a journalist that called me and asked me about John, and I said he was such an important voice in the sound management of the nation's public lands, and he stood for balanced management. He stood for public involvement. He stood for conservation, but I think one of the most important things is he stood for, write this one down, students, relationship building. And what I learned, and John knew, in my 38-year federal career, which is part in the Bureau of Land Management, part in the Forest Service, was it's all about relationships. And that is, I worry about that today. You know, I do worry about that in this country today, because those are so important for getting things done on the ground. Respect and relationships. You don't always have to agree. And for example, we're going to get into the National Environmental Policy Act here in a minute, but you know, when I was working in you know, Shoshone, Idaho, I spent several years in Shoshone, Idaho. I spent several years in Little Lakeview, Oregon. Lakeview, Oregon, you know, town of 2,600 people, county of 5,000 people. And you build relationships, and I built them in the bleachers of the high school basketball game in those small towns. Because I got a lot of public lands business done in the bleachers of the high school basketball game, because that's how it works. Well, when I was back in Washington, D.C., working as in the senior career position in the Bureau of Land Management, it was no different. The relationships I built back there, I built in a similar way. It wasn't the Shoshone high school bleachers at the high school basketball games. It was with OMB, Office of Management Budget Examiners, maybe having a cup of coffee at a place between the White House and the main Interior Building, right? 3 blocks. Stop, have a cup of coffee, and talking about various public lands issues. I would get in a cab, right? I'd go to the Hill, and I would have conversations with staffers. There were a few hangouts near Capitol Hill, Bull Feathers and some others, where we'd have conversations about various issues where they wanted to get by the politicals, right? The political firewall, and talk to career people, experienced career people like me. And you build those relationships. And Office of Management Budget, of course, is important for funding for all federal agencies. And also I built relationships like that with various NGOs, with people in the department. So it was the same thing I did in Shoshone. It was the same thing I did in Lakeview. It was the same thing I did when I was Idaho State Director. And it was what John Freemuth was all about. He realized the importance of building these relationships, across party lines, regardless of, your positions, whether it be on domestic livestock grazing or whatever. It's communications, relationships, and respect. So that is one of the things I learned that from John. Really, I learned it on my journey, but it was something that John Freemuth, one of the things he was about that I really liked. So anyway, let's move on, and I've got some slides here, and I thought today I was going to focus on a couple areas. Really, the National Environmental Policy Act and land use planning. And Jim Lyons, a friend of mine, he's going to talk to you, I think, next week. And I worked with Jim when I was back in D.C., and he may touch on some of this too. But the National Environmental Policy Act came about in 1969. I was in high school in 1969. And actually Nixon signed it into law in 1970. And we're not going to go through NEPA. We're not going to read it. I think I sent it out for all of you to read, and it's something that you probably should read through. But what I want to talk about here are some of the take-home messages of NEPA and what I learned in my 38 years. And it was something that basically required all agencies to go through a formal process before taking a federal action that would have substantial impact on the environment. So I'm going to give you some examples. I think I'll try to use as many Idaho-specific examples as I could that I could use them for all over the Bureau. But in Idaho, back in prior to the National Environmental Policy Act, when say the Bureau of Land Management in Burley or Pocatello or anywhere where they were going to go out and they would often go out and spray 2,4-D on sagebrush, right? They just get these fixed wing aircraft, and away they go, spray 2,4-D to kill sagebrush, where they drag the big anchor chains, right? These are the old days, across the land down there, these big anchor chains, and roll over sagebrush and junipers and archaeological sites and so forth, and they would just do it. And mostly it was done to have more grass, right, for domestic livestock grazing. And so with the advent of NEPA, I'll give you one other example, the Hells Canyon Dam. The Hells Canyon Dam, back in the 60s, when that was plunked in over there, it blocked salmon and steelhead migration. So they put that dam in, and then, lo and behold, they look down and the water's boiling, with salmon and steelhead down below the dam. And it was like, oh. And so this was done all prior to the National Environmental Policy Act, where the decision maker, the law then required the decision maker to assess the impacts of what they were planning to do and a reasonable range of alternatives, including the no action alternative. And so, so that was a key part of NEPA. What the BLM did not realize when they were spraying 2,4-D on all that sagebrush and dragging those anchor chains across the landscape, that they were doing what? They were contributing to the demise of a species, greater sage-grouse. They were destroying greater sage-grouse habitat, but there was no federal law or process that required them to take pause and think about the impacts of what we're going to do on everything else. So that's what NEPA helped with. The other thing that the National Environmental Policy Act did is it provided for public engagement and transparency. All right, so let's go back to the spraying the 2,4-D, again, as an example. Had NEPA been in place, they would have had to air this proposed action publicly, right? They would have had to put it out to the public, give the public opportunity to have input on what they're proposing to do and actually be transparent on the potential impacts, science-based, right? Science-based, and so it would have created transparency. It wouldn't be like Aaron here, having to drive down there between Burley and Pocatello down through that Malad country and looking around saying, whoa, what happened here? Well, the sagebrush is dead. You wonder what happened here. With NEPA, see, it's all public. It's transparent, public engagement. So that's part of the decision-making process, and so that's a key part of NEPA. It also formally provided the decision maker. In many cases, that was me in my career. Required me to look at the environmental consequences of what I was going to do, the social impacts of what I was going to do. It required me to look at a reasonable range of alternatives, including the do nothing alternative. So one of those alternatives, again, going back to my original example, would have been what happens if we don't do anything? What happens if we don't spray anything? What happens if we don't drag these anchor chains out here? And so an example in Idaho, another example of Idaho, when I was state director of Idaho, I came in and I was dealing with the fallout from a lawsuit that, the conservation and environmental community had won. I think it was Western Watershed Projects against the BLM on a land use plan down in, the Shoshone area where I worked, back in the mid 80s. And what the Bureau of Land Management did was they did an environmental impact statement as part of the land use plan, but they did not include a no grazing alternative. So they looked at various alternatives for managing that land down, like Shoshone, Arco, south of Arco, and west of Idaho Falls, that whole area down there in north of Kamima. And what they did is they decided, well, we're not going to have a no grazing alternative. And one of the reasons that was done by one of my predecessors, not me, was pressure from the livestock community who didn't want a no grazing alternative in there because they were fearful that if there's a no grazing alternative that, well, it might be picked. Well, what they were, it got into federal court, and Judge Lynn Windmill sent the Bureau back to redo that document for an A, right? They just said, you got to go back and you've got to look at this no grazing alternative. So that, of course, cost a lot of money to do that. So when I came in as state director, I remember talking to the cattlemen, Idaho cattlemen, and even some people from the governor's office on why it would be to their benefit to have a no grazing alternative. Now think of this. I'm telling you, livestock people, why is it to your benefit to go back and redo that for and have a no grazing alternative? You guys should be pushing for that. And they couldn't figure this out. And I said, here's why. Every alternative you look at, you have to have an impacts analysis. Right. So you people are saying if you take domestic livestock grazing off, right, have no livestock grazing, which could have been Western Watershed's Project Dream, right, take the cows off, which I don't support that, by the way. I support managed grazing. You say there'll be bigger range fires, right, because it's not grazed, bigger range fires that could take out sagebrush, right, so it could contribute to the loss of greater sage-grouse habitat and other species that live out in the sagebrush steppe. And they said, yeah, that's true. And I said, well, how are you going to daylight those impacts if you don't have no grazing alternative? You see, so an alternative doesn't mean you're going to pick it. So once they saw that, once they realized that they could actually daylight some of the positives of managed, right, properly managed domestic livestock grazing, they didn't resist it anymore. In fact, they thought, that sort of makes sense. So that's why, having a reasonable range of alternatives that the public helps you with, right? The public helps you produce these things is important. And that's NEPA, right? That's part of NEPA. So the other thing it does is it allows the incorporation of current science, and that's huge. Incorporating current science, and I worry about that these days in some of the planning documents that these agencies are doing. In what I learned in federal court, and I've been in federal court a lot. When I was forest supervisor on Wallowa-Whitman, more than once was I over here in Eugene, right, in settlement meetings with plaintiffs on various issues, and one, there's two things I learned in the NEPA process. One is if you don't follow process, it'll get you, right? And if you don't use science, it'll get you. So if you look at where the current administration has been losing some of these court cases, including in Idaho, it's on process, shortcutting the process, and ignoring science. So you look at those two things, and when I've been sued, I have, and I've learned from this. I mean, I made some mistakes, and I've learned. I've learned that if you start shortcutting process, the organizations will come after you on process, right? If you're required to have a 90-day comment period and you shorten it by 2 days, they can send you back to the drawing board just on something like that. And if you shortcut science, the court case there on greater sage-grouse here in the last year in Idaho, I believe it was some changes that they made, and they didn't have the science to back it up. And so there you go. Those are the two things. And so anyway, planning for healthy landscapes. One of the things that I've also learned in my career, that it's really helpful to plan on a landscape basis. And that's what we were trying to do when I was Idaho State Director and when I was Deputy Director of the agency, is try to look more on a landscape scale. Because if you look at the greater sage-grouse, that species, that habitat crosses several states. I think most of it's in Wyoming, but it crosses a lot of states. And so historically, both the BLM and the Forest Service looked in terms of administrative boundaries, like the Shoshone BLM district or the Boise BLM district, or the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, and historically that's what we've done. And what we were pushing for was to try to look at things more on a landscape scale, because we know fire doesn't recognize administrative boundaries. I mean, I just, I experienced that just right outside my window here a few weeks ago, where that fire came off the forest down across the state land, the BLM land, and onto this private land out here. And species are the same way, whether it be greater sage-grouse, elk or mule deer, they do travel, and they don't look at a map and say, well, there's a green on the map, that's the Forest Service, there's a yellow, that's BLM, there's the blue, that's the state land. And so it makes a lot of sense to look in terms of the whole landscape. We'll go on to the next slide here. Good. The other thing I wanted to highlight, and that is, again, right, I'm retired, so I can say things like this. I'm very concerned, as I told a reporter for The Hill a couple of days ago, and in an article that was in The Hill, that I think right now, with this administration, they're way out of balance. This is supposed to be multiple use and sustained yield, and they're leaning way over towards fossil fuel extraction. And one of the things that concerns me is outdoor recreation has been a growing industry in this country my whole career. It has really grown from the time I started in 1979 there in Burley, Idaho, in 79, to when I retired in 2016. Recreation has continued to grow. And with this COVID thing, I know people are recreating even more out here on the public lands, out where I live and in other areas. So this is huge. And when I was in Idaho and when I was deputy director, we were really emphasizing outdoor recreation. Next slide, please. Fish and wildlife habitat. The state manages the wildlife, and that's the way it should be. The Forest Service and the BLM manage the habitat. And so it's important in these planning processes to work closely, like in Idaho, with Idaho Fish and Game. Virgil Moore, I used to meet regularly with Virgil Moore when he was the director. And when I was deputy director and we were working Greater Sage Routes, I still met and talked with Virgil Moore on the phone. I think he's retired now. Personally, to veer off on the wild horses a little bit, sometimes I don't know if it's such a bad idea to let the state manage the wild horses, although they're not going to, right? Are they going to want them? I don't know. I never brought this up with Virgil, but still, habitat is key. Having healthy habitat for fish and wildlife is key, and it should be part of every land use plan, and that's why it's important to manage on a landscape scale. Next slide, please. Treasured landscapes. Now I'm going to divert here to the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA. The Bureau of Land Management, that's really the foundation document for the BLM. Historically, the BLM, I think, was created and Harry Truman was president. That had been 1946. I think they combined the U.S. Grazing Service and the General Land Office were combined I think by executive order, came the Bureau of Land Management. But their main mission at that time was still to dispose of public land. So the BLM manages about 10% of the nation's surface estate. Think of that. 10% of the country, the surface estate, is managed by the BLM. And prior to 1976, their mission was to dispose of those lands. And so when FLPMA was created, it changed, it cemented their mission in as multiple use, okay, and then I'm going to underline this, and sustained yield, right? So, and sustained yield is not in a smaller font. I mean, if you pull out your pocket FLPMA, I don't have one, if you pull out your pocket FLPMA, you would see and sustained yield. And many people don't add that part on when they talk about it. They talk about the multiple use agency, but they don't talk about sustained yield. And sustained yield is really that conservation part that Congress put in there to sustain these lands for future generations. I think it's even in there if you read it. And so as part of FLPMA, that gave BLM really a mandate on treasured landscapes. I call them treasured landscapes, but it allowed for Congress then to give BLM national monuments, national conservation areas, manage wild and scenic rivers, and I call these treasured landscapes. That's a term I use, I'll continue to use. And personally, I think one of those treasured landscapes is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and I don't think they ought to be drilling up there, and I've gone on record, I think even to the Washington Post, telling them that. But I, especially when the nation's drowning in oil, And that's one of the treasured landscapes. But anyway, these FLTMA now allows made allowance for that for the Bureau of Land Management as part of their sustained yield mission. Next slide, please. Sagebrush step. When I was talking to some UNLV, doing a class like this, UNLV law students here a week before we had all the fires, and one of the students asked me a question. And I wrote that down here somewhere. Here we go. The students asked me a question, and the question was, what were the most important policy goals, things that you worked on when you were in DC, and then what were some of your best and worst days on the job? That was actually a good question of this law student. And I stopped and I thought about, I did 2 tours in DC, and this slide probably, I think, was one of the most critical things I worked on, and that was the Greater Sagebrush Steppe Conservation Plan, where we signed that document off just like a month or two before we all left, and it was a plan across multiple states. Right, Idaho was part of this to conserve the habitat of the greater sage grouse and still provide for multiple use and sustained yield. And so the greater sage grouse was really a mine canary. And I've seen during my career what I would call the decline of the sagebrush steppe habitat. I've seen it in southern Idaho. I've seen it when I worked in Nevada. I've seen it when I worked in Eastern Oregon. And that decline of the Great Basin habitat, and climate change is playing part of this. This greater sage grouse is, to me, a mine canary, and there's many other species out there, but our goal was labeled greater sage grouse, but really it was conserving sagebrush steppe. That's why I put that heading on the slide. It was sagebrush steppe. It was for all the species and try to turn around this decline in the health Great Basin. Next slide, please. Sustaining healthy forest. I'm a forester, and foresters like me, we love timber sales, and I think the key to sustaining healthy forest is active forest management. And just before I left, like 2 months before I retired, I signed 2 land use plans for Western Oregon, and they basically replaced the Northwest Forest Plan that was done during the Clinton administration. And so we were going to have one plan. We had 2 plans. We had one for the wet forest in the north, one for the dry forest, the Medford country, one for the country I live in, the wetter forest. And our focus here was sustaining healthy forest and continue to have timber sales, and yet preserve old growth and habitat for other species such as northern spotted owl. And it's hard to find, when you're working this multi-use and sustained yield business, this can be a challenge because you have all kinds of groups lining up for various uses, whether it be timber, wildlife, old growth, and they all have their interpretation of what multi-use and sustained yield is. And we tried to strike a balance here. The one key thing about this plan, and it has survived so far, it's been almost 4 years and this plan has survived, and that is we had the support of the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries, right? The 2 regulatory agencies endorsed our prescription, which actually increased the cut. And so we got sued by the greens, we got sued by the timber industry, but the thing is still standing today and they're implementing it. So sustaining healthy forest is key, but this thing that came in my back door the other day was really a Santa Ana wind driven event. So, it was blowing through Christmas tree farms out here. So no amount of raking the woods or thin the trees is going to stop that crown-driven thing with 40-mile-an-hour winds. That's the way it is. But healthy forests are key. There's many ways to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, wildland fire. You had Grant Beebe come in and talk about this. I, worked a lot in fire in my career. Was on a fire team, Great Basin fire team for many years there in Idaho and Nevada. But I think, in the essence of time, we're going to move on here. We could probably do a whole nother series on fire, but I think that the only thing I'll say here, and that is climate change is playing a role in this. There are three things I think playing a role here. One is climate change. One is there's more people out there. So when you have more people out there in the wildland urban interface and out recreating, you have more an opportunity for human caused fires. You also, we have more power lines out there now, crossing public lands, because you have to, when you have a source, whether it be geothermal, solar, coal-fired plants in Wyoming, like that gateway transmission line through southern Idaho, which came from, the Wyoming coal-fired plant, you get more of a potential for starts of these wildfires. That's why they're having to shut power down in California, during high wind events. So you've got, force management in part, ladder fuels, reducing ladder fuels is part, but climate change is a part, and which affects the drying of fuels and so forth, and also the fact that there's more people out there. This fire that almost burned us out here about 10 days ago was a human-caused fire that started, in a recreation area over here in the Clackamas River where I run my kayak, and so great, more people out there. Next slide. Anyway, NEPA, I talked about this. Richard Nixon. God, I think we called him Tricky Dick. I remember when I was a kid, I think that's the name, Tricky Dick. See, they even had names for people back then. And he signed that into law. Okay, we covered that. We'll keep going here. Again, I talked here about the take-home messages, and hopefully the students will all get copies of these slides. But again, these are especially two important areas: public engagement and transparency, and formally provide the decision maker with these impacts. Next slide. Okay, we talked about landscape approach. We talked a little bit about a proposed action and a reasonable range of alternatives. We want to talk a little bit about who makes the decision. And I want to touch on what just happened here recently in the federal court in Montana with William Penley, right, the acting director of the BLM. Okay, so take a look down there at who makes the decision. So a federal judge in Montana just ruled that Penley was serving illegally as director of the BLM, and then he was taken out of that role. And there were people, they were applauding that. And I got to thinking, but he's still there. He's still there. And so I was talking to a reporter who called me from a publication the other day, and I said, he'll still be there. I mean, he's not going anywhere. They'll just change his title, right? But he'll still be there. And so I told this reporter, he said, well, what's important here? And I said, I'm going to tell you what's important here. It's the decisions that he made while he was in as acting director during that period of time, those hundreds of days that he was in there, where the judge says that it was illegal. Right? So who makes the decision? So in both the BLM and the Forest Service, there's a delegation of authority, a written delegation of authority for who gets to make decisions on various things. So in BLM, the Boise district manager is delegated authority to make certain decisions. The Idaho state director right now is John Roos. He's delegated certain authorities. The forest supervisor on the Boise National Force is delegated in writing, right, by regulation, certain things that they can officially sign decisions on, as is the director of the BLM. So and the acting director of the BLM. So if the court, which the court has ruled and said, all right, Penley was in that position illegally, the immediate thing came to my mind is, what did the guy sign during that time frame? What did he sign where he had the delegation authority? I mean, including personnel actions to move people to Grand Junction, Colorado. Did he sign those? I don't know if he signed those. But what I told this reporter from, Greenwire, right, from Greenwire, I said, the thing to watch here is if all his formal decisions are invalidated by the court. All right, now so how many of those land use plans, like up in Montana, where they, included a lot of additional areas for oil and gas leasing, I mean, how much of that stuff did he sign? I don't know, but it would bring into question all that. So to me, that's the biggie of this whole thing. I mean, he's not even going to move his office. He won't even move his chair back there. He'll change his title, and he'll still be there. So who makes the decision? That's delegated, and the thing you have to do is, when you go through the NEPA process, you can do an EA, an EIS. We'll go to the next slide. An EA, environmental assessment, environmental impact statement, or you can do a categorical exclusion, all under NEPA. It's all in the National Environmental Policy Act. But as a decision maker, if you do an environmental assessment, you have to sign a document. It's required by law. It's in NEPA. You have to sign a document. It's called a finding of no significant impact. So you have to state that decision you're making does not have a significant impact on the environment. Okay, that's very key. And what the conservation environmental community will do, they'll go through your environmental assessment and they'll look for anywhere you use the word significant. If you use the word significant, they'll say, aha, you said there was a significant impact here. You signed a FONSI that said there wasn't, so you should do an EIS. And so anyway, the decision maker, the authority they have and what they do is a very key part. Partnering with local communities. This is so important that I learned it in your land use planning process. It's important to build relationships, to involve local communities in your planning from the ground up, right? The public, early in my career, we put out a planning document, let the public react to it. Well, they don't want to do that anymore. They don't want to react to what you right, the bureaucrats do, right? In Shoshone, Twin Falls, Boise. They want to be part of developing that process from the ground up, and I don't blame them. Right? That's really how it should be. And what another thing concerns me of this administration is some of this has gone on, like in Colorado and Montana, and then back in Washington, D.C., they change things, right? If there's not enough, if this partnering with local communities doesn't come up with enough areas that are open to oil and gas leasing, they're making these changes up in the department, and that's, I find, troubling. And so, but partnering with local communities and having community involvement is important. And you're going to get disagreements, right? But it's important to collaboratively work these things out. It saves you time in the courtroom, folks. I've learned that. It really does. You can spend the time here, or you can spend the time in court. Next slide, please. Oh, this is I probably should have had this slide first. This gets back to that EA versus EIS versus categorical exclusion. And a categorical exclusion is something, I sign those things in Shoshone, and basically it's something you sign off on if you're going to put in a cattle guard, right? A cattle guard on a road. It's a categorical exclusion. Environmental assessment would be the next level, and environmental impact statement would be the next level. And the difference between an EA and an EIS, a lot of it is the mandatory comment periods and so forth. The document size. This is another conversation I had with a reporter a few years ago when I think Zinke was secretary, came in and said, well, EISs are not going to exceed 100 pages. And I was asked for my comment on that. And I said, well, I said, personally, I've done these, 38 years I've done these things. I always think it'd be 50 pages. But I said, it's not the size of the document, whether it be 50 pages, 100 pages, or 300 pages. It's a quality of document, and did you fully assess the impacts of the proposed action and a reasonable range of alternatives? And what'll happen is if you come in and I say to John Ruse there, the current Idaho State Director, okay, if you're going to do an EIS on, land use plan down the Boise district, it can't be over 100 pages. So John says, it won't be, sir, but we're going to have to shortchange the impacts. Where our climate change discussion may only be 3 sentences, but we'll make that 100 pages. So what's going to happen is you're going to end up in court, and you're going to get nailed on process. So it shouldn't be the size. It's did you fully assess things like cumulative effects, climate change, incorporate the science. If you can do that in 100 pages, fine. If you can't, that should not be the focus. Finding of no significant impact, we just talked about that. The FONSI, record of decision. Until there's a record of decision, you can't file a lawsuit. So there's a draft. You do a draft EA or a draft environmental impact statement, and but until there's a ROD, right, a record of decision, whether it be greater sage grouse or timber sale or a grazing plan in Owyhee County, that record of decision is where the decision maker has to justify what they're doing, right, based on their analysis. If they have a record of decision and they choose something where the impacts weren't assessed in one of those NEPA documents, the court's gonna correct them. Next slide. Cumulative effects. I've lost on cumulative effects. I've learned that it's important to address cumulative effects when you're doing these NEPA documents. And so when I put these bullets on here, these are basically based on 38 years of experience. So science-based documents usually prevail in court. And if I look at where I've been beaten up a few times and where the current administration is losing, they're shortcutting science. And so that's important. Climate change is a reality. Human-caused climate change. Now, people have argued, and I studied this in grad school, and climate is always changing, right? If that wasn't true, we wouldn't have had these signs of glaciation, right? In the upper Midwest where I grew up, they wouldn't be mining coal in Wyoming, right? Because climate does change. But what we're looking at is human-caused climate change, which is a reality, and I could do a whole lecture on this, and I won't. So we're going to move on. But what I want to say is it's important to address climate change in all your NEPA documents, and I could give you a lot of examples of what I've observed in my career that shows this is going on. Cumulative effects analysis. This is another area that it's important to assess cumulatively the impact on what you're doing. I'm going to give you an Idaho example. So when I was in Shoshone, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, was looking at licensing some mini hydro projects up in, that Haley, Bellevue, north of Fairfield country, up to there. And these proponents were coming in, and they were proposing to put mini hydros in up on these streams. Now, mini hydro on a creek, that's where you have, put a little dam in and you produce electricity, called mini hydro. And so if you look at like chunking in one of these things up, pick a stream up there, a creek up there in that country, maybe not a big deal. But if you look across the whole landscape, remember we talked about the landscape planning, and you look at 30 of these, right? Cumulatively, the impact of 30 of these is a big deal. So that's sort of a simple terms of what a cumulative effects analysis is. You have to look not only at what you're doing, but you have to look at reasonable foreseeable actions, or what could happen cumulatively. And that's what we did when we did the Greater Sage-Grouse Plan. We had to look at what Wyoming was doing, right, on oil and gas and infrastructure versus, what Idaho was doing, and cumulatively how that would affect the population of greater sage-grouse. Cumulative effects analysis. The last thing, and this is an important one too, the public doesn't often engage until they think they may lose something. And I mean, as sad as it is, that's been my experience. And it cuts across a lot of things. It's not only in public lands issues. So let me give you an example. When I was forest supervisor on the Wallowa-Whitman, we were doing, the Blue Mountain Forest Plan, and we get some public involvement. The usual cast of characters that usually engage in those things. The various interest groups, and then we were doing travel management planning. We started this travel management planning because all the national forests in the country were directed by Chief Bosworth at the time to get travel management plans done by a certain amount of time. The Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, I think, was the second or third most eroded forest in the United States, all from the timber sale days. And all these roads were open up to ATVs. So you could ride your quad basically anywhere and cross country. So what we were going to do, we had a proposed action that would roll back some of these roads to OHV use. And so, in other words, if we had, say, 3 roads going up into an area, we might close 1 or 2 of them, leave 1 open. And so we had enough open roads on that forest where you could drive your ATV across the United States and halfway back. I mean, honest to God, that's how many miles of roads we had across the country, a time and a half. And so our proposed action was to reduce that, I think, by maybe 40%, and then close some of the cross-country OHV travel. Well, boy, I mean, people woke up to this. And so it was, we had, they packed the public meetings. And that's a good thing, right? We got a lot of public input, and people woke up because they said, wow, we're going to lose something here. We're going to lose the opportunity to ride our ATVs everywhere we want to go. And so we never had this kind of interest in our plan that we're doing on the Blue Mountain Forest, but boy, the ATVs, here they come. And so that engagement was a good thing. I'm glad we heard from them. It's better to hear from them up front as you're going through the process, so you can modify the process. So, but anyway, same with greater sage-grouse. People saw that it might impact infrastructure, then they became very engaged. So next slide. Emily, how are we doing on time?
I'd say about 5 more minutes. And then we have a couple of good questions already coming in. So
I've been on a roll here. Let's see here. We're getting science and chemical effects. Let's go to the next slide. We'll pop on that.
I think that was the last one, unless.
Oh, that's it. Oh my gosh, look at that. So let me, in the last 5 minutes, let me look and see if I missed anything here from my notes. I think I mentioned one more thing, and then we'll open it up to questions on anything you want to talk about. You have the National Environmental Policy Act. We talked about that. Then you have, we follow NEPA, and then we follow the Council on Environmental Quality Regulations. We call it CEQ regulations. CEQ is part of the White House. And they develop the regulations and rules under the National Environmental Policy Act. Okay, so you go by NEPA, you go by CEQ regs, and then you go by case law. So the judicial system comes last, right? So you have NEPA, you follow the CEQ regs, you do your EIS or do your EIA, and then comes the lawsuits, and you end up in court, and there's various court decisions, and that becomes case law. So when you're doing land use planning, you look at all three. You look at NEPA, CQ regs, and you look at the case law, right? So you got to look and see, well, how did the federal court in Idaho rule on this issue? The court in Montana or Oregon rule on this issue? And you look at that case law, and the smart ones learn from that case law, and that's sort of what really guides you. The other thing is that it's important to engage with the State Historic Preservation Officer, we call it the SHPO, on cultural impacts. It's important to have meaningful government-to-government consultation with tribes, and I did that regularly in Idaho. Work with the various tribes. In Oregon, when I was on the Wallowa-Whitman, we worked really closely with the Nez Perce tribe. They're up in Lapway, and that it has to be meaningful, right? Because they can tell if you're just checking the box to consult with them, and they don't come to public meetings, right? They're a sovereign nation, so you go to them, right? They don't come in your public meetings. You go to them and work with them. Again, Emily, that could be a whole other lecture too, but I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on the importance of involving Native American tribes in what you do out there on public lands management. So important. So I'm going to quit and see what's on your minds.
Jamie Pinkham, I think he's going to talk with us towards the end of the class. So he's going to talk a good bit about that in regards to the salmon. So, but it's a thread through all of these issues. So there have been a couple really great student questions, and I'll let those students go ahead and ask those themselves. But I'm going to pull rank here and insert my own question at the beginning, because I'm curious to hear what it was like for you holding leadership positions across the agencies, and what were the differences in leading the BLM versus the Forest Service, and how are you able to take one agency and sort of move to the other, and then vice versa? Could you talk a little bit about that briefly?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I tell people I couldn't hold a job. I started my career in the Forest Service in Region 9, and then went to BLM and then back to Forest Service, back to BLM, and really, if I look back at the great people, look at the career. I was a careerist, right, on a political appointee, and they're just terrific people in both organizations. I think one of the big differences, they're really both multiple use sustained yield type of agencies. They manage different landscapes for the most part, except in Western Oregon here, the BLM has more forest land than the Forest Service, believe it or not, in Western Oregon. And it's called the ONC lands. But the Forest Service is all career. Okay, so the chief is career, top to bottom. There are no political appointees in the Forest Service, unless you would call the chief, a political, but it would be a small p, right? And the political appointees are in the department. Now, in the BLM, it's different. The director is a political appointee. Look, and the senior career position that I was in, so the director of the BLM is a political appointee by law under FLTMA. It's in FLTMA, so FLTMA would have to be changed to have it all career. And then the front hall of the BLM had various political appointees, and that's how people like Penley were in there. So when I was deputy director, Neil Cornsey was the confirmed director of the BLM. And so as a result, my experience is the BLM is more susceptible to shifts in these political winds with changes in administration, especially with parties. So I started, Cecil Andrus was Interior Secretary, Jimmy Carter was in the White House. I retired at the end of the Obama administration, and Sally Jewell was Interior Secretary, and the pendulum swung back and forth, and the Bureau is more susceptible to those swings and those political influences than the Forest Service. So I think those are some of the big things. But the organizational structure, they're set up very similar: line staff relationship, state director, regional forester, forest supervisor, district manager, district ranger. field manager. But I would say you don't see as much of this in the Forest Service as you do in BLM. That's a short answer.
Fascinating. Well, thank you. Alyssa Cepeda had a really great follow-up on that, asking you about the future of BLM. Alyssa, I'm going to let you ask it because you worded it so nicely in the chat, if you're still there.
Yeah, so I was asking that you mentioned that the BLM was a multiple use agency by law, but with the current administration, there are a lot more focus on the fossil fuel extractions going on and leaving the multiple use agency really unbalanced. So I was curious to know, what do you think the future of the BLM looks like now, even with the penalty drama going on? And what are your hopes for the future of the BLM agency?
Well, we have an election coming up, and of course, you can probably imagine who I'm going to be voting for. But multi-use and sustained yield to me means it should be balanced, and that's what I always try to do. I always try to balance those things. Right, I support active forest management, but I'm not the type of person that thinks that active forest management means clear cutting off the mountain. Right, it's the sustainable type of forestry. I support domestic livestock grazing on public land, but as people know, when I was Idaho State Director, I was dealing with some great overgrazing issues down in Owyhee County because our monitoring data showed that they weren't meeting the rangeland health standards, right? And I told the cattlemen down there, if you meet the rangeland health standards, knock yourself out, but you're not. So we're gonna have to make some changes in numbers down here, and they're going south. So it is out of balance. It's leaning way over to fossil fuel extraction. They're leasing areas of public land for oil and gas development that, in my opinion, they shouldn't be, and there's no need to be with the nation drowning in oil right now. Remember when Carter was in the White House, we had the gas lines. I was on those gas lines. We have plenty of oil. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful for a new administration that will bring these things back in balance. And I think on the energy front, on the fossil fuel energy front, that the country needs to take a look at, a serious look at it. Is that something we should still be doing on public lands? Is that something that should be continued? I think the country needs an energy plan that takes into account the reality of climate change. There's some states that are trying to do this, right? But the nation as a whole needs to do this and develop a whole plan, because I think, what do we have? 9 years left to get our arms around this thing before we go off the cliff, I think is what I've read. So public lands are important. So I hope things are brought back into balance. We really need to look at fossil fuel extraction on public lands. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful we get there. And the public's going to have to engage in this too. Right? The public is going to have to step up and help the agencies move this direction. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. So there were a couple other questions about the moving of the BLM or the relocation. So there's certainly some students, I think Aaron and another Alyssa had some questions about that. Would you guys like to chime in here?
I could chime in. I can't help but feel badly for all the employees that got moved from Washington to Colorado, and now that, like you said, that some of the decisions that Penley made are going to be reversed. There's talk of them all being moved back to Washington, and I was hoping you could speak on what those employees are thinking now, and maybe what the employees that didn't make the move to Colorado in the first place are doing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I mean, my position on that's very clear. You can Google my name and that office move, and I remember from Washington Post all the way through on what a bad move that is. And Dr. Freemuth and I had a lot of conversation about what a bad move that was. And here's why. The spin, right? The spin out there is, oh, we'll get the decision makers out on the ground, with the policy closer to the ground, right? That is the spin. And for the average person, they might think, oh, well, that makes sense. Okay, let's dissect this a little bit. In the Washington office, that's about 3% of the Bureau's total workforce. 3%, all right? So 97% of them are out here on the ground, right? I talked about the delegation of authority. So those decisions are delegated out here. They're delegated to the state director, the district manager, field manager, and so forth. So they're all delegated. But the function of those people in Washington office, let's look at their function. Okay, I spent 9 years there on 2 tours, and as a staffer and as a leader. So I've got a pretty good idea of what that function is. Okay, one of those functions is building those relationships with, right, the department, with Office of Management Budget, with Capitol Hill, with all the NGOs and all the other federal agencies who are still back there, right? They're not in Grand Junction, Colorado. They're still back there. So your job is to develop, right, relationships and work closely with those people. Well, how are you going to do that on Zoom from Grand Junction, Colorado? You know, when I came back there, when I went from Idaho State Director to Deputy Director of BLM, I mean, Sally Jewell knew of me, right? She knew of me, but she didn't know me. And when I was back there, then she got to know me, and all the other political department got to know me. If I had been an occasional drop-in on a jet from Grand Junction, Colorado, I could not have built those relationships. So those relationships are very important. And all the staff back there and the leaders, they're all engaging, right, with those key people in the DC bubble, because that's their job, right? That is their job. Now, here's the other thing. So county commissioners and special interest groups, and we'll go back to Idaho, county commissioners from Idaho, county from Idaho, people from Idaho Conservation League, so they all go back to DC. Now this is, I want to put COVID aside, right? Okay, they go back to DC and they make the rounds. So what they do, called making the rounds, so go back for a week, and I had Idaho County Commissioners come in, they come in and see me, and they would go to BLM, they go to the Forest Service, they go up in Crapo's office, right, Maricia's office, and Simpson's office, and then they go over to the National Association of Counties, they go to NACO, they make the rounds, and they're all on budgets, right, in the Idaho cattlemen come into, and so and all over the country, this is going on, right? So now, when they come back and make the rounds, right, again, putting COVID aside, the BLM's not there. Now, I've already been hearing this from some groups. We go back there, and we're not going to take an extra jet flight to Grand Junction, Colorado. You know, you just can't, you know, who's going to do that, right? They're not going to go, you know, fly to Denver and then take the flight from Denver to Grand Junction, or fly into Salt Lake to Grand Junction. They're not going to do it. And so what you have is these career people, you know, they're out there in Grand Junction, Colorado, and I've got my, you know, I think there are other political things going on there as to why that town and that state, but regardless, whether it be Grand Junction, Colorado, Ely, Nevada, Salmon, Idaho, they need to be, that 3% need to be in the bubble, because that's their function. Their function is to not be out here making decisions on the ground, because you've got those people already here. And so the other thing they've talked about is the rent. They said, well, we're saving money on rent. Well, you know, there's a cost. It's not just rent. See, there's a cost to the agency of not being there. So if rent were the issue, then I would argue, why is the Arizona State Office in Phoenix, where they're paying almost $1 million a year to rent in Phoenix, why aren't they put that office in Kingman, Arizona? You see, so that's not the real reason. So I think what has to happen, I think they need to get BLM leadership and their key staff, their key advisors and so forth back in the bubble. And then the staff that they've shotgunned all around the West, you know, I think that can be looked at more surgically, but it's hard for them to work as an interdisciplinary team if they're not together in DC. And when I was there, we actually had a plan. We had a plan when that M Street lease expired as to what to do. The M Street lease, we got a bargain basement rate. When that part of DC was just starting to build up, and then Nationals Park came in half a block away, right by the ballpark. They hit a foul ball, it could almost hit the building, and we knew that we could not afford to renew that lease. So we were already looking at options, and I doubt if they even pulled out our book on that. So.
Alyssa Wolf had a connection that she wanted to make between the NEPA process and that movement. Was there anything more specific you wanted to add there, Alyssa?
I think you kind of discussed, among the relationships, but my question was just, how does moving the BLM headquarters, from Washington to Grand Junction would affect NEPA and its process? And you kind of discussed how it was building the relationship and the function of that 3%, but I don't know if you had any more to add specifically on that.
Well, there's several areas, but let me explain what I think the biggest one is. So back in the Washington office, we had, those of us in Main Interior, we had a lot of staff on M Street over by Nationals Ballpark. Okay, we had our NEPA people over there. Those are the people, seasoned specialists in National Environmental Policy Act and Land Use Planning, that did the Washington office review of every BLM land use planning process. So they done it my whole career. They were always there. The people have turned over, but they're always there. And that was their job, to take and look at those three things I talked about: NEPA, CEQ, and case law. And they had attorneys looking at that too. So when I was Idaho State Director and sent a draft plan back there, that team would look at it. Right? They're gone now. Okay, so who has taken that place? Politicals. Politicals in the department are now filling that role. So when a land use plan goes back there, political appointees up in the Secretariat's office are now looking at those land use plans. And let me give you an example, the one in Montana, right? That the governor of Montana, Bullock, got so concerned about, that opened up 95% of the BLM lands to oil and gas leasing. So who did that review on that plan? It wasn't that NEPA team in Washington D.C. They're gone, right? Those are career people. It was the political. So they looked at that thing, right? And they said, well, boy, your collaborative plan doesn't open enough areas for oil and gas. So we're gonna have an alternative in here and do it. And not only that, that's going to be the one that's picked. See, so that's a problem, right? That's a problem. It's a problem for two or three areas. One is it sort of flies in the face of the local collaborative process, where theoretically, locally, and with the public involvement, they come up with the plan and how you're going to move forward. It basically, what it says is, well, we don't like what you guys came up with, and so it didn't have enough oil and gas development proposed leasing in it. So here, we're going to tell you how it's going to be. All right. And yet the spin is we're getting the decisions out on the ground. But in reality is they're centralizing more of these decisions with politicals in the department and in the Beltway. And the career people have been moved out of the way. So that NEPA staff, so the whole Washington staff, career staff, I think 50 or 60% of them just walked. I think they just left because, a lot of them back there, they have, partners or spouses, partners, whatever, that have other jobs too. And so, my first tour back there, my nurse wife who worked there at St. Luke's Hospital, she went back, she worked at Fairfax Hospital when we lived in Fairfax, and she was labor and delivery at St. Luke's, and then she was labor and delivery at, Fairfax Hospital back there. She had a job, and there's a lot of others. They weren't moved. They couldn't move. In my wife's profession, it wasn't difficult, but there's others whose partners, spouses could not. So a lot of them just left. And in those that moved out west, I don't know exactly how many. It's been a moving number. I know it was 40% or so that did come out. They're scattered around these various state offices. So it's going to be difficult for them to work in an interdisciplinary team. Now, someone could argue, well, under COVID, we're all doing Zoom anyway, but I'm hoping this isn't forever. And there's nothing like when they were back there, they were able to actually sit around the table, all these different specialists sit around the table and discuss these things. So I think that's one of the biggest impacts. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Class is officially ending now, and I know a couple people have classes to get to and work and some other things. So if you need to leave, please go ahead and do that. But there are a couple lingering questions, both about sort of a censorship-like question from Leif and then a recreational question from Eli. If either of you would like to pipe in with those, I think we can stay on for a little while longer.
Sure.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I guess my question was kind of stemming from the movie on Friday that premiered, the Public Lands movie. They kind of talked about what happened with the current administration and the EPA and some of those other programs and how people were silenced or relocated. I was just curious what your thoughts were, because it seems like in the current administration, the more educated you are on some of these issues, the more likely you are to not be listened to or heard. And so I was curious what you thought would happen if you were still with the BLM today.
Okay, well, what movie? Was this like the Patagonia movie or?
Yeah, Public Trust.
Yeah, the Public Trust. And I learned about that. I haven't seen it yet. I think the Conservation Lands Foundation website, you can click and view it. I just haven't had time, and I will. So I got to tell you, I haven't seen the movie yet. But let me maybe respond this way. To me, and again, as retired, I can say this. I would call this deconstructing conservation. That's what they're doing. This administration is deconstructing conservation. And there's a term for you. And so everything they're doing seems to be leaning that way. The other thing they're doing is they're marginalizing science. I see this up and down the line in natural resources. They're whether it be climate change or other areas, greater sage-grouse impacts, they seem to be marginalizing this science. And that troubles me too, because decisions should be resource and science-based decisions, right? Multiple use and sustained yield, right? But resource and science-based decisions versus extractive industry-based decisions. And it seems to me that what we're seeing now is extractive energy-based decisions. What I always pushed for in my career in Idaho and other places was resource and science-based decisions when we're making decisions, whether it be livestock grazing, timber sales, anything else. Because that's how I view it in short.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
I think it's connected to your previous comments as well about the deprofessionalization of it, right? And forcing people to make choices that they didn't need to make before, rather about moving or not moving, and about how they build those connections. And that seems to be a force in deprofessionalizing. One of the conversations that John Primuth and I had before he passed away, he was working with us on building a public lands boot camp, a summer experience for students to work on an issue intensively over time. And he made the point repeatedly that NEPA analysts were the most sought after positions and would only increase in the next 10 years. Plus, of course, NEPA is nullified, right? Which might be an alternative. But he regularly made it. So I think this is a relevant point for students to think about how they might envision themselves doing this work, right? And being the people that sit around the table and make these decisions in a balanced, measured, scientifically evidence-based way, and to build build that body of work. So just a brief comment. Let's take a couple more student questions if there are some. Stephanie, do you have something?
I mean, not really. I thought in the readings this week, it was interesting, just the kind of rhetoric about like taking climate change and global climate out of the out of the budgets, the budget requests, and also the freeze on websites of just not adding information since 2016. I think is bizarre, but I think it's also pretty easy to figure out the reasons for that.
Yeah, I think we know, and it's very troubling. This pulling out of this Paris Climate Accord, that was a terrible move. And if the Biden administration comes in, which I hope they do, we need to get back engaged in that. We need to become leaders in this. All up and down the line, not just on public lands, but this is a big issue, and for younger people in your generation, and my grandkids, right? My grandkids. If we don't get this ship right, get this thing turned around, holy cow! It's not these people that are pushing this bad policy, right? They're going to be gone, right? But you people, and my kids, my grandkids, my kids in their 30s, right? My grandkids in grade school. They're going to be on the receiving end of a lot of this. Well, and we already are. I almost got burned out of here 10 days ago. That fire, I'm pointing out the window. It was like 2 miles. The wind shifted, and it was 2 miles from my 10 acres here. And, it chased us out of here, but that thing marched, 36 miles in 2.5 days and did a 180 2 miles from our place. And so, these, I call them climate fires, and that's what they are. So, this fire these were Santa Ana type winds, and we don't have those in Oregon this time of year. Southern California, yes, but not Oregon, and that's what we had. And that's climate change. And I said earlier, you're not going to rake your way out of that one out here in the woods. It's not going to do it. So these fires we're having over here, they're getting bigger, they're getting worse. The fire season's getting longer, and we're going to have to deal with more of this. The hurricanes, same thing with the hurricanes. That's basically latent heat of evaporation, right? Warmer surface ocean temperatures, more latent heat of evaporation, bigger, powerful, more frequent, powerful hurricanes and storms. It's basic physics. If you guys take physics, it's physics 101, latent heat of evaporation, and the law of angular momentum. Right? That's how it cranks, and so there's a lot of things out there. The Arctic. Look at the Arctic. I don't know if you've ever been up to Alaska. I've been up there several times, and especially Barrow and those places up in Alaska. They've been seeing the effects of this for several years. The Arctic, things are starting to change up there because they're sort of on the edge of the stuff, and they're seeing the sea levels rise from these Arctic villages that have been on the ocean up there for thousands of years. They're seeing temperature rise. It's all there. It's right in front of us. The reality is there. We have to get a plan, right? Have a plan to deal with this, and that's politically. We were on a good path. The country was actually on a good path, and worked with other nations, and it just got derailed overnight.
I agree. It's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're concerned about climate change. I really am, because it's your generation that has to start really beating the drum on this. You really keep up the drumbeat on this climate change. I really encourage you to do it. It's huge. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Mackenzie or Jessica or Xander or anybody else have a question?
Well, you talked about, I have a question. You had talked about an increased use of public lands from recreation, especially with new users due to COVID. I just wanted to ask what you would like to see from outdoor recreation industry.
Well, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think I've got them in a file cabinet over here that I keep for media calls on the billions of dollars that the recreation industry contributes to the economy from recreating on public lands, and it's increasing. Like in southern Utah, The Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument was created when Clinton was in the White House. Boy, there's a hoopla down there with the locals. But then they found out that they sort of had a gold mine in recreation. They developed really an economy down in Moab and those other areas down there around the recreation on public lands. And then the administration came in and they reduced significantly the size of both those national monuments for what? Fossil fuel, right? And they're going in there and they're leasing some of those areas now for fossil fuel extraction. And so this gets back to some of the old school people and how they view public lands and really like prior to Flipma. So if you look at William Perry's writings, a lot of his writings about the federal lands, the public lands should, go to the states or the private sector. This is sort of what was going on actually pre-Flipma. This was the pre-Flipma idea, and the people that opposed Flipma coming in that wanted these lands to continue to be developed for oil and gas and coal. Recreation was not an issue and to be disposed of. And so some of that mentality is in the department today, where recreation is not a big deal. Now certainly, they'll do something like, I think Penley made this statement a year or so ago about how they use the Land and Water Conservation Fund to acquire some private lands up in Montana on that river that the River and Stewart movie was filmed. I can't remember the name offhand. But what he didn't add is that acquisition was actually started by career people during the Obama administration, right? It takes years to bring those together, and he was actually happened to be in the chair when they finally got the paperwork done, so he could sign the thing and take credit for it. But the other thing is, I think in that Montana plan, they also, had a couple special designations up there in backcountry conservation areas or something like that. And what I tell people is don't look at the name. I mean, you can spin a name, but look at what is the difference between what you can do on the ground there today or can't do on the ground there today versus before that designation was made. And essentially, that designation, they're appealing to the sportsman. I'm one of those. I have to fish and hunt and so forth. But really, what they don't say is those public lands were open to hunting and fishing before. Right? I mean, they've always been open hunting and fishing, so it didn't really change anything. So they have a title on there to try to appeal to people to think they're doing something for conservation. Essentially, all it was a name, and it really essentially didn't change what sportsmen can or can't do up on that piece of ground. So, but national monuments, wild and scenic rivers, these special areas, recreation is. It drives the recreational economy. The other thing it does, it provides connectivity for wildlife and landscape. So if you have, you have various national monuments out there, it'll preserve habitat and it'll make connectivity for habitat, regardless of the species, that's so important. And it will help you get through ESA lawsuits and issues too by having those connectivity areas. So it's more than recreation, but the recreational demand has increased on public lands my whole career, both on national forest lands and on BLM lands. It's not stabilized, it's not gone down, it's only increased. And under COVID, I live, the Mount Hood National Forest is right up here, not far from me. I'm almost right up against it. And I've seen, well, not right now, the forest is closed because of fires, but before it was, a lot of people recreating up there. That's where I take my kayak and paddle down the Clackamas River and take my horse up and ride. And so it's huge, and the recreation industry, they know this, and it's important for the recreation industry, back to your question, to promote recreational use on public lands. Especially personally for me, it's self-propelled things versus motorized things. I mean, motorized an ATV use is a legitimate use on public lands, but it needs to be managed, right? Like everything else has to be managed. So, but boy, these areas are, these national monuments and so forth are, they're heavily utilized by the public loves them. They do.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Anyone else?
Wait too much more of your time, but just going back to the NEPA process, and you talked a lot about science helping make those decisions. What do you think the role is of social values, especially with high profile decisions? Like I'm thinking of the Bears Ears issue. You know, a lot of the public comments to me seem to reflect more of a social or cultural connection to a landscape than the scientific values. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that plays a role in NEPA decisions.
Yeah, well, you're supposed to, required by NEPA to look at what's called social economic impact, social impact. So that means you go and you look at how the impacts of that action, take the Bears Ears, how that would impact the local communities from the standpoint of recreation, standpoint of the economy, tribes, right? When I went down there, Secretary had me go down there to a secret meeting that was supposedly a secret meeting with the tribes out there on the land, and then it was on the front page of the Salt Lake Tribune the very next day. So, you know, went down there and we met, there were 2 or 3 of us went down there, John Jarvis, Director of Park Service, myself, and Nikki Buffa, who's Deputy Chief of Staff for the Secretary. And we met with the tribal leaders out there at Bears Ears. We met on the ground with, you know, the Hopi people and Navajo people, all the other tribes. And it was a full day. It was a great session, and we listened to them. It was mostly a listening session to listen to them about the importance of that area. And you know, in the tribes, they all were, you know, together on that. It was actually a pretty historic meeting because I was told, I don't know this for sure, I was told that was the first time all those tribal leaders from all those nations actually sat down in one spot, right, and held hands and had a common goal, and so we listened to them and about their interest. We listened to them about how important and special that area was to them, the whole greater Bears Ears area. And so, and that was done through the Antiquities Act, right? That wasn't a NEPA process. The NEPA process came later after the Antiquities Act was used to designate the area, and the NEPA process comes in the planning. But I touched on that because that should be part of, you know, the NEPA process about the social look at things. You need to look holistically at all these impacts, and for students, I think for students that are going to, you know, be involved in land use planning, I think one of the skills that's important to have is listening skills, because when you go into a collaborative process, you want to do more listening than telling. Right? You want to be a good listener, and it's important that the public and the stakeholders feel that you're actually listening to them meaningfully. And so that's an important part of the collaborative process. And I see that as it's not working today, right? I see it more today. They may go through the process, but even worse, and you have people in DC now that are saying, well, I don't like the way that came out, so here, this is the way it's going to be. And that's not how it's supposed to work. And so yeah, it's social economic is required to be looked at, but you got to look at everything, and the cumulative impacts. We talked about that, cumulative impacts. Change is hard for people, right? You look at Southern Utah. I remember early in my career, I went to Moab, Utah, back in the early 80s. And that was an energy, right? Energy, uranium, down in Moab, and that drove, the county commissioners. Extractive industry drove that whole area, with the exception of Arches National Monument, may have been a national monument at that time, outside town, right? The red. But they looked at the BLM lands not for mountain biking, right? They didn't look at themselves as a mountain biking mecca back then. And since that time, that whole community has changed. Right? I went to Moab because I had a college buddy that worked for BLM down there, a friend of mine. We went down to visit them, and that whole thing has changed. So now Moab, you think of Moab, you think of mountain biking and recreation versus mining uranium, coal, things like that. And so that's how that shift has taken place, and that's how that economy has shifted to away from extractive type of uses. Not that it still doesn't go on down there, not that there's still some that think that that part of Utah ought to go back to that. So that's what a lot of troubles me so much about the people that are running things right now. They tend to, they're very focused on that extractive side and not really where I think the rest of the country's going. Right? The country likes these treasured landscapes. They do, and economies need to, they can change, right? They're going to have to change, and they will. They adjust. Thank you. Question.
Does anybody else have a final question for Steve?
Nothing on wild horses or Clive Bundy. That's fine. No, this has been great. Again, it's really a privilege to be part of this John Freeman salute. He's such a great guy. I miss him. I think of him often, and I know others do too. It's just a wonderful, wonderful person.